Miss Marple and the Poisoned Chalice. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm your host, Connor, and tonight I'm delighted to guide you through another captivating mystery from the village of St. Mary Mead. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from this evening. Drop a comment below and let me know your corner of the globe. Now, settle into your favourite chair, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, and let us begin our journey into a most perplexing case of murder most foul. Chapter 1. The Ceremony Interrupted. The morning of the 15th of October dawned with that peculiar golden quality that sometimes graces an English autumn, when the light seems to hold within it both the memory of summer warmth and the promise of winter's approaching chill. Miss Jane Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and after a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she had dressed with particular care for the morning service at St. Mary Mead's parish church. Today was no ordinary Sunday. The church was to host a baptism ceremony for young Thomas Weatherby, the infant son of Major Weatherby and his wife Eleanor, who had only recently taken up residence at Fernley House on the outskirts of the village. The baptism had generated considerable interest among the parishioners, not least because the godparents were to include Mr. Philip Ashford, a respected London barrister who had been the Major's commanding officer during the war, and Lady Caroline Brent, whose family had been prominent in the county for generations. Miss Marple made her way along the familiar path to St. Mary Mead's Norman church, her sensible shoes making soft sounds against the fallen leaves that carpeted the walkway. The church bells were calling the faithful to worship, their bronze voices carrying across the village with comforting authority. She nodded pleasantly to Mrs. Dane, the butcher's wife, and exchanged a few words with Colonel Melrose about the unusually fine weather. The interior of the church was filled with the warm scent of beeswax candles and the autumn flowers that Mrs. Price Ridley had arranged with her customary elaborate fussiness. Miss Marple took her accustomed place in the third pew from the front on the left side, from which vantage point she could observe the proceedings with her characteristic quiet attention. Already the church was filling with villagers, their Sunday best lending an air of festivity to the occasion. At precisely 10 minutes before 11, the Weatherby family arrived, accompanied by the godparents. Major Weatherby was a tall, distinguished man in his early 40s, with the upright bearing of a career military officer. His wife Eleanor carried the infant Thomas, who was mercifully quiet in his elaborate christening gown of antique lace. Mr. Philip Ashford followed behind them, a lean man of perhaps 50 years, with iron-grey hair and the shrewd, assessing eyes of one accustomed to weighing evidence and judging character. Lady Caroline Brent completed the party, resplendent in a hat that Miss Marple privately considered rather too elaborate for a country church, though the lady herself carried it off with the confident authority of one born to wear such things. Chapter 2. The Silver Chalice. The baptismal ceremony proceeded with solemn dignity as Reverend Clement performed the ancient ritual with the practised ease of long experience. The infant Thomas bore his immersion in the holy water with admirable fortitude, producing only a few startled whimpers before settling back into peaceful silence. Miss Marple watched as the godparents made their vows to guide the child in his Christian life, noting the confident tones of Mr. Ashford and the rather breathless responses of Lady Caroline, who appeared troubled by a persistent headache. It was the tradition at St. Mary Mead, when a baptism occurred during the main Sunday service, for the ceremony to conclude with a special communion service in which the baptismal party would partake first, using the church's ceremonial silver chalice rather than the ordinary wooden communion cups used for the general congregation. This chalice was a magnificent piece of medieval workmanship, donated to the church in the 15th century by a wealthy wool merchant seeking to purchase prayers for his soul. Miss Marple had always found this tradition rather charming, a link to the ancient practices of the church that gave weight and solemnity to the sacrament. She watched now as Reverend Clement moved to the altar to prepare the communion elements, assisted by his wife Griselda, who had volunteered to help with the service despite being in the early months of an eagerly anticipated pregnancy. The ceremonial chalice sat upon the altar, gleaming softly in the light that streamed through the stained glass windows. It had been filled earlier that morning, Miss Marple knew, as part of the pre-service preparations. Beside it rested the paten bearing the communion wafers, and the ordinary communion cups that would be used for the congregation stood ready on a side table. Reverend Clement raised the ceremonial chalice and spoke the words of institution with quiet reverence. According to the protocol that had been followed for decades at St. Mary Mead, the godfather was to receive communion first, followed by the godmother, then the parents, and finally the infant would be blessed. Mr. Ashford stepped forward in response to the vicar's invitation, his face composed in an expression of appropriate solemnity. But at that precise moment, Lady Caroline gave a small cry and swayed alarmingly. Several hands reached out to steady her, and there was a moment of confusion as the lady was helped to a nearby pew, fanning herself with her prayer book and apologizing profusely for the disruption. The headache, she explained in faint tones, had become quite overwhelming, and she feared she might faint if she remained standing. Reverend Clement, ever practical in matters of church ceremony, made an immediate adjustment to the protocol. Rather than delay the service while Lady Caroline recovered, he suggested that he himself would receive communion first, followed by Mr. Ashford, then the Major and Mrs. Weatherby, and finally Lady Caroline, when she felt sufficiently recovered. Chapter 3. Dr. Haydock's Grim Diagnosis. The chaos in the church gradually resolved itself into a more organised response as Dr. Haydock took command of the situation with the calm authority that came from decades of medical practice. He barked orders for someone to telephone for an ambulance, sent his wife to fetch his medical bag from their nearby house, and continued his examination of Reverend Clement with focused intensity. Miss Marple watched as Griselda Clement knelt beside her husband, her young face pale with shock and her hands trembling as she reached for his. The vicar's breathing had become increasingly laboured, and even from her position several pews back, Miss Marple could see that his face had taken on a distinctly bluish tinge that spoke of severe oxygen deprivation. His body was convulsing slightly, muscles twitching in a manner that struck her as deeply wrong. Mrs. Haydock returned with admirable speed, carrying her husband's worn leather medical bag. The doctor extracted his stethoscope and bent low over the stricken vicar, listening intently to his heart and lungs. When he straightened, his expression was grave, and Miss Marple saw him exchange a significant glance with his wife that confirmed her growing suspicions that this was no ordinary medical emergency. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, though to those waiting in the tense silence of the church, it seemed far longer. The attendants loaded Reverend Clement onto a stretcher with practised efficiency, and Dr. Haydock accompanied them, speaking in low, urgent tones to the senior ambulance man. Griselda Clement climbed into the ambulance beside her husband, her face set in lines of determined courage, though tears streamed down her cheeks. As the ambulance departed, its bell clanging urgently, the congregation began to disperse, speaking in hushed, shocked tones. Major Weatherby stood with his arm around his wife, who was weeping quietly into his shoulder while still clutching their infant son. Mr. Ashford had gone very pale and stood slightly apart from the others, staring at the spilled communion wine with an expression that Miss Marple found difficult to interpret but deeply interesting. Lady Caroline had recovered from her headache with remarkable speed and was now the centre of a group of concerned parishioners, all eager to hear her account of what she had witnessed. Miss Marple noted with interest that the lady's colour had returned completely, and she showed no signs of the distress that had overcome her so conveniently just before the communion service. Inspector Slack arrived at the church within the hour, summoned by Dr. Haydock's telephone call from the hospital. The inspector was a solid man with a tendency toward hasty conclusions, though Miss Marple had found that he could be guided toward more accurate deductions with sufficient patience and tact. He was accompanied by Constable Polk, who produced his notebook and began taking statements from the witnesses with methodical efficiency. Chapter 4. The Protocol That Changed. The afternoon following the tragedy found Miss Marple seated in her comfortable cottage, her knitting needles clicking with their customary rhythm, while her mind worked through the various elements of the morning's disturbing events. She had invited her friend and neighbour Miss Bunner for tea, knowing that the faithful companion to the late Miss Blacklock would have gathered considerable information through her extensive network of village contacts. Miss Bunner, known to her friends as Bunny, arrived promptly at 4 o'clock, her round face flushed with excitement, and her tongue ready to share every morsel of gossip and speculation that had circulated through St. Mary Mead in the hours since the poisoning. Miss Marple poured tea, and offered cucumber sandwiches while encouraging her guests to share everything she had learned. The primary topic of discussion was, naturally, the change in protocol that had resulted in Reverend Clement drinking from the poisoned chalice rather than Mr. Ashford. Miss Bunner was convinced that this represented divine intervention, protecting the innocent godfather from harm intended for another target entirely. Miss Marple listened to this theory with polite attention while privately reserving judgment on both the divine nature of the intervention and the assumption that Mr. Ashford had been the intended victim. According to Miss Bunner's information, which she had obtained from Mrs. Dane, who had it from her sister who worked at Fernley House, the original baptism plans had been quite different from what actually transpired. Lady Caroline Brent had only agreed to serve as godmother 3 days before the ceremony, replacing Miss Weatherby's sister, who had fallen ill with influenza and been unable to travel from Scotland. This last-minute substitution had necessitated hasty arrangements, and Lady Caroline had arrived in St. Mary Mead only the evening before the baptism, staying as a guest at Fernley House. Miss Bunner reported, with the air of one sharing highly significant intelligence, that Lady Caroline had complained of feeling unwell from the moment of her arrival, suffering from what she described as a nervous headache brought on by the strain of rapid travel. Miss Marple found this information quite interesting, particularly when combined with her own observations of Lady Caroline's convenient indisposition during the communion service. The timing of the lady's collapse had been remarkably precise, occurring at exactly the moment when she would otherwise have been required to watch Mr. Ashford drink from the poisoned chalice first, according to the established protocol. The question of who had prepared the communion wine was also a matter of considerable discussion. Mrs. Clement had traditionally been responsible for this task, but with her pregnancy causing frequent bouts of morning sickness, she had delegated the duty to various parishioners in recent weeks. On this particular Sunday, according to Miss Bunner's intelligence, the communion wine had been prepared by Miss Hartnell, the church warden. Chapter 5. The Godfather's Secret. The following morning brought news from the hospital that Reverend Clement's condition had stabilized, though he remained unconscious and the doctors were uncertain when or if he would wake. Miss Marple received this information from Dr. Haydock, who called at her cottage shortly after breakfast to share the latest developments, and, she suspected, to benefit from her insights into the case. The doctor settled himself in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room and accepted a cup of tea while reporting that the chemical analysis of the chalice's contents had confirmed the presence of potassium cyanide in a concentration that would have proven fatal to anyone who consumed more than a small quantity. Reverend Clement had survived only because his customary practice was to take merely a sip from the chalice rather than a full swallow, and because Dr. Haydock had recognized the symptoms quickly enough to administer the appropriate antidote. Miss Marple listened to this information with grave attention, her knitting needles pausing in their rhythm as she considered the implications. The use of cyanide suggested either medical or chemical knowledge, as the poison was not readily available to the average person. It also indicated a certain ruthlessness, as cyanide was known to cause a particularly agonizing death if administered in sufficient quantity. Dr. Haydock then shared another piece of information that he had not yet reported to Inspector Slack, pending Miss Marple's assessment of its significance. In examining Reverend Clement's medical records, he had discovered that the vicar suffered from a heart condition that had been diagnosed some 5 years earlier. While the condition was manageable with proper medication and posed no immediate threat to his life, it did mean that he was more susceptible to the effects of certain poisons than a healthier individual would be. This medical information had been known only to Dr. Haydock and Reverend Clement himself, who had chosen not to share it with his wife or the parish council for fear of causing unnecessary alarm. The question was whether the poisoner had somehow learned of the vicar's vulnerability and had tailored their method accordingly, or whether it was merely a coincidence that the chosen poison would prove particularly dangerous to someone with Reverend Clement's condition. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft click and regarded Dr. Haydock with her mild blue eyes. She suggested, in her gentle way, that perhaps the poisoner had not known about the vicar's heart condition at all, and that in fact the vicar might not have been the intended victim. Dr. Haydock looked startled by this suggestion and asked her to elaborate. Miss Marple explained her reasoning with characteristic clarity. The original protocol for the communion service would have had Mr. Ashford drinking first from the chalice, followed by the other members of the baptismal party. Only Lady Caroline's sudden indisposition had led to the change in order that resulted in Reverend Clement drinking first instead. Chapter 6. Lady Caroline's Convenient Headache. Inspector Slack had established a temporary headquarters in the church hall, where he conducted his interviews with the efficiency of a man determined to solve the case quickly and move on to less troublesome matters. Miss Marple, having received a polite invitation to share her observations, arrived at the appointed hour carrying her knitting bag and wearing an expression of mild helpfulness that concealed a mind working with razor-sharp precision. The inspector greeted her with the resigned courtesy of one who had learned that dismissing Miss Marple's insights was generally counterproductive. He had already interviewed most of the witnesses who had been present at the service, and he shared with her his preliminary conclusions. In his view, the poisoning had most likely been the work of someone with a grudge against the church or Reverend Clement personally, and he was pursuing inquiries into several individuals who had expressed dissatisfaction with recent parish decisions. Miss Marple listened to this theory with patient attention before gently suggesting that the inspector might wish to consider whether Reverend Clement had been the intended victim at all. She explained her reasoning about the protocol change and the possibility that Mr. Ashford had been the target. Inspector Slack frowned at this suggestion, arguing that it seemed far-fetched to imagine that someone would poison communion wine in the hope of killing a specific individual when the order of communion was not fixed. However, Miss Marple pointed out, the order had been fixed according to long-standing tradition, and only Lady Caroline's indisposition had changed it. She then mentioned, with appropriate delicacy, that she had observed Lady Caroline during the service and had noticed several details that might prove relevant to the investigation. Inspector Slack sighed, but produced his notebook and prepared to take notes. Miss Marple described how Lady Caroline had appeared perfectly well during the early part of the service, singing the hymns with good voice and showing no signs of distress. The headache had manifested itself quite suddenly, just as the baptismal party was preparing to receive communion. Moreover, the symptoms had resolved themselves with remarkable speed once the crisis had passed, suggesting that the affliction might have been more convenient than genuine. Inspector Slack made a note of this observation and admitted that it did seem suggestive. He had not yet had the opportunity to interview Lady Caroline thoroughly, as she had retired to Fernley House, claiming nervous exhaustion immediately after giving her initial statement. Miss Marple suggested that perhaps a visit to Fernley House might prove illuminating, and the inspector agreed to make this a priority. Before leaving the church hall, Miss Marple mentioned one other detail that she had noticed during the service. While Lady Caroline had been suffering from her apparent headache, she had been pressing her fingers to her temples in a manner that struck Miss Marple as slightly theatrical. Chapter 7. The hit-and-run connection. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected quarter. Miss Marple received a telegram from her London correspondent, the friend who had been making inquiries into Mr. Ashford's legal career. The telegram was brief but illuminating, reporting that Mr. Ashford had recently been in contact with a witness from a notable hit-and-run case who claimed to have new information that could potentially overturn a previous acquittal. This witness, a retired lorry driver named Thomas Bentley, had come forward after seeing a newspaper article about the anniversary of the victim's death. Mr. Bentley claimed that he had been driving on the same road on the night of the accident and had witnessed the hit-and-run vehicle fleeing the scene. At the time, he had been delivering goods and had not stopped because he was running late for his delivery deadline, but his conscience had troubled him ever since. Mr. Bentley's account included details about the vehicle that had not been made public during the original investigation, details that he claimed would conclusively identify Martin Gresham, a wealthy businessman, as the driver. Mr. Ashford had been investigating these claims and had determined that Mr. Bentley appeared to be a credible witness whose testimony could potentially lead to a new trial. The original case had been sensational, involving the death of a young mother named Sarah Collins, who had been crossing the street near her home when she was struck by a speeding vehicle that had failed to stop. Miss Marple showed this telegram to Inspector Slack, who had developed sufficient respect for her methods to take the information seriously. The inspector immediately contacted the London police and requested information about Martin Gresham's current whereabouts and activities. The response came within hours and proved highly significant. Martin Gresham had been absent from his Hampshire estate for the past week, claiming to be on a private holiday. His staff reported that he had been in a state of considerable agitation before his departure, making numerous telephone calls and meeting with visitors whose names he had not disclosed. More significantly, his personal motorcar had been spotted in the vicinity of St. Mary Mead on the day before the baptism, though Gresham himself had not been identified by any witnesses who could provide reliable testimony. Inspector Slack issued instructions for Gresham to be located and questioned, but the businessman proved difficult to find. His staff claimed ignorance of his precise location, saying only that he had mentioned visiting friends in the country and would return when it suited him. The inspector found this vagueness suspicious and intensified his efforts to track down the elusive businessman. He assigned Constable Polk to make inquiries at local hotels and guest houses, reasoning that Gresham must have stayed somewhere in the area if his vehicle had been spotted near the village. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had been pursuing her own line of inquiry, one that focused on Lady Caroline Brent's connection to Martin Gresham. Through discreet questions posed to Mrs. Weatherby and other sources, she learned that Lady Caroline was Martin Gresham's cousin and had been quite vocal in her support of him during his trial. She had attended court every day and had publicly proclaimed her conviction that her cousin was innocent of the hit-and-run charge, even going so far as to write letters to the newspapers defending his character. This family connection cast Lady Caroline's involvement in the baptism in an entirely new light. Her insistence on serving as godmother despite the inconvenience, her particular interest in the communion protocol, and her conveniently timed headache all suddenly appeared far less innocent. Miss Marple shared this information with Inspector Slack, who agreed that it constituted a compelling motive for Lady Caroline to participate in a plot to harm Mr. Ashford. The inspector also learned from his London colleagues that the original trial had been controversial. Mr. Ashford had successfully defended Gresham by arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that several witnesses had provided alibis for his client's whereabouts at the time of the accident. However, there had been persistent rumours that some of these witnesses had been paid for their testimony, though nothing had ever been proven. The victim's family had been devastated by the acquittal and had vowed to continue seeking justice for Sarah Collins. Chapter 8. The Vicar Awakens. The 7th day after the poisoning brought the news that had been anxiously awaited throughout St. Mary Mead. Reverend Clement had regained consciousness and was reported to be recovering, though still weak and confused. Dr. Haydock permitted Inspector Slack and Miss Marple to visit the vicar briefly, in the hope that he might remember something about the communion service that would help solve the case. They found Reverend Clement propped up on pillows in his hospital bed, his face pale, but his eyes clear and alert. Griselda sat beside him, holding his hand with obvious relief and devotion. The vicar greeted his visitors with a weak smile and apologized for causing such a commotion, a remark that caused his wife to burst into tears and embrace him carefully. Dr. Haydock had warned them that the vicar's memory might be impaired by the trauma he had suffered, but Reverend Clement seemed remarkably lucid considering his ordeal. Inspector Slack conducted the interview with appropriate sensitivity to the vicar's condition, asking simple questions and allowing ample time for responses. Reverend Clement reported that he remembered very little of the actual poisoning. He recalled beginning the communion service and raising the chalice to drink, but his next clear memory was waking in the hospital several days later with no idea what had transpired. The moments immediately before and after his collapse remained a complete blank, as though they had been erased from his mind entirely. However, he did remember the events leading up to the service with reasonable clarity. He particularly recalled Lady Caroline's headache and the change in communion protocol that had resulted. At the time, he had thought nothing of it beyond natural concern for the lady's well-being. Now, knowing what had transpired, he found himself wondering whether the headache had been genuine or merely a performance designed to alter the order of communion and save Mr. Ashford from the poisoned chalice. Miss Marple asked, with appropriate gentleness, whether the vicar had noticed anything unusual about the chalice when he had raised it to drink. Reverend Clement frowned with the effort of recollection and said that he thought perhaps the wine had tasted slightly bitter, but he had attributed this to the particular vintage and had not been alarmed. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock interjected, would indeed have imparted a bitter almond taste to the wine, though the communion wine's own complex flavours might have masked the poison's taste to some degree. The vicar then mentioned something that proved to be highly significant. On the morning of the baptism, while he had been preparing for the service in the vestry, He had encountered Mr. Ashford in the church. The barrister had seemed agitated and had asked to speak privately with Reverend Clement about a matter of conscience that was troubling him. The vicar had been somewhat surprised by this request, as he did not know Mr. Ashford particularly well, but he had sensed that the man was genuinely distressed. Their conversation had been brief, as the vicar had needed to complete his preparations for the service, but Mr. Ashford had revealed that he possessed information about a past crime that he felt obligated to report to the authorities. He had sought the vicar's counsel on whether he was morally bound to come forward, despite the professional complications this might create. Mr. Ashford had explained that he had defended a man several years ago who he now believed to be guilty, and that new evidence had come to light that could overturn the acquittal. Reverend Clement had advised Mr. Ashford that truth and justice must take precedence over professional considerations, and that if he possessed knowledge of a crime, he had both a moral and legal duty to report it. The vicar had quoted scripture about the importance of bearing true witness, and had assured Mr. Ashford that while the decision might be professionally difficult, it was morally clear. Mr. Ashford had thanked him for this counsel, and had seemed to reach a decision, saying that he would contact the police immediately after the baptism ceremony concluded. This conversation cast the morning's events in a dramatically different light. If Martin Gresham had somehow learned that Mr. Ashford was planning to report new evidence about the hit-and-run case, it provided a powerful motive for murder. Inspector Slack asked whether anyone else might have overheard this conversation, and Reverend Clement replied that it had taken place in the vestry with the door closed, so he did not believe anyone could have listened without being detected. However, Miss Marple pointed out that the vestry window had been opened that morning to air out the room, and someone standing outside might have been able to hear at least portions of the conversation. The inspector made a note to investigate this possibility, and to determine whether anyone had been seen near the vestry window during the relevant time period. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. Inspector Slack, armed with the information from Reverend Clement and Miss Marple's careful deductions, devised a plan to bring the conspirators to justice. He arranged for word to be leaked through carefully selected channels that Mr. Ashford was planning to meet with the new witness, Thomas Bentley, at a specific location on a specific date to review the evidence that would reopen the hit-and-run case. The inspector hoped that this news would provoke Martin Gresham into making some rash move that would confirm his involvement in the poisoning attempt. The location chosen for this fictitious meeting was a quiet tea room in a neighbouring village, and the date was set for 3 days hence. Inspector Slack ensured that word of the meeting reached several people who might be connected to Gresham, including a journalist who had covered the original trial and who was known to maintain contact with various parties involved in the case. The inspector gambled that news of the meeting would reach Gresham quickly, and that the businessman would feel compelled to take action. Miss Marple suggested, with her characteristic gentle insight, that Lady Caroline might prove to be the weaker link in the conspiracy, and that pressure applied to her might yield results more quickly than pursuing Gresham directly. She noted that Lady Caroline had shown signs of considerable strain since the poisoning, and that the lady's conscience might be more accessible than her cousin's, particularly if she had not fully understood the deadly nature of the plot she had helped to execute. Acting on this suggestion, Inspector Slack paid a formal call on Lady Caroline at Fernley House, where she had remained as a guest of the Weatherbys despite her earlier expressed intention to return to London. The inspector informed her that he had evidence linking her to Martin Gresham, and that he believed she had knowledge of a plot to murder Mr. Ashford by poisoning the communion wine. He spoke in firm but measured tones, watching her reactions carefully as he laid out the case against her. Lady Caroline initially maintained her composure, denying any involvement and expressing shock and outrage at the suggestion. She claimed that her headache during the service had been entirely genuine, and that any similarity between her symptoms and a deliberate disruption of the communion protocol was purely coincidental. She insisted that she barely knew her cousin Gresham, and that they had not been in contact for several months prior to the baptism. However, when Inspector Slack revealed that he had obtained telephone records showing numerous calls between her London residence and Martin Gresham's estate in the weeks leading up to the baptism, her facade began to crack. The colour drained from her face, and she reached for the arm of her chair as though needing physical support. The inspector pressed his advantage, explaining that the evidence against her was substantial, and that her best hope of leniency lay in cooperating with the investigation and providing testimony against Gresham. He painted a vivid picture of what awaited her if she was convicted of attempted murder, speaking of years in prison and the permanent disgrace that would attach to her family name. He mentioned that her late father, a decorated military hero, would have his reputation tarnished by association with her crime, and that her younger sister, who was engaged to be married to a promising diplomat, would likely see her engagement broken off when news of the scandal became public. Miss Marple, who had accompanied the inspector to Fernley House at his request, observed Lady Caroline carefully throughout this interview. She noted the telltale signs of increasing panic in the lady's demeanour, the way her hands trembled despite her efforts to control them, and the sheen of perspiration that appeared on her brow despite the coolness of the room. When Lady Caroline's eyes filled with tears, Miss Marple knew that the moment had come for a different approach. It was Miss Marple who delivered the final, decisive blow to Lady Caroline's resistance. Speaking in her gentle, grandmotherly fashion, she remarked that it must be a terrible burden to carry the knowledge that one's actions, however well-intentioned, had nearly resulted in the death of an innocent man. She suggested that perhaps Lady Caroline had not fully understood what her cousin was planning, and that her role had been more limited than Inspector Slack supposed. Perhaps, Miss Marple continued, Lady Caroline had been deceived by Gresham just as surely as she had attempted to deceive others. Chapter 10. Justice and Confession. Lady Caroline's confession, once begun, poured forth in a torrent of guilty relief. She explained that Martin Gresham had contacted her in desperation several weeks before the baptism, explaining that Mr. Ashford had found a new witness who claimed to have seen the hit-and-run accident. Gresham had convinced her that Mr. Ashford was acting from malicious motives rather than concern for justice, and that the barrister intended to manufacture evidence to support a false accusation. Gresham had painted himself as the victim of a vendetta, and Lady Caroline, devoted to her cousin and predisposed to believe in his innocence, had accepted this version of events without question. The plan had been Gresham's conception from the start. He had learned through his contacts that Mr. Ashford was to serve as godfather at the Wetherby baptism, and he had seen an opportunity to eliminate the threat the barrister posed. Gresham had researched the communion customs at St. Mary Mead, and had determined that the godfather would drink first from the ceremonial chalice, providing a predictable opportunity for poisoning. He had explained to Lady Caroline that he needed her help to ensure that justice was not perverted by Ashford's supposed vendetta. Lady Caroline's role had been to volunteer as godmother, replacing the original choice who had fallen conveniently ill with influenza after receiving a gift basket of fruit that had been deliberately contaminated with a mild emetic. Once in position as godmother, Lady Caroline was to ensure that the protocol was followed and that Mr. Ashford drank from the poisoned chalice as planned. However, Lady Caroline insisted tearfully that she had not known Gresham intended to use cyanide, nor had she understood the lethal nature of the plot. Gresham had told her only that the wine would be doctored with a substance that would make Mr. Ashford ill enough to be unable to meet with the witness, buying time for Gresham to discredit Thomas Bentley's testimony through other means. Lady Caroline claimed that she had believed the plan was merely to cause temporary illness, not to commit murder. She had imagined that Mr. Ashford would become sick, perhaps vomit or faint, and would be forced to postpone his meeting while he recovered. She had not realized that cyanide was a deadly poison. The poisoning itself had been accomplished by Gresham on the morning of the baptism. Disguised in workman's clothes and carrying a tool bag that made him appear to be a maintenance worker or tradesman, he had entered the church during a period when Miss Hartnell was absent from the sanctuary, attending to duties in the church hall. He had added the cyanide to the ceremonial chalice, calculating the dose carefully to ensure a fatal result, then had departed without being recognized by any of the few people who had seen him in the church. Lady Caroline claimed that her headache during the service had been genuine, brought on by the stress of her guilty knowledge and her growing suspicion that Gresham's plans were more sinister than he had revealed. When she had realized that she would be required to watch Mr. Ashford drink from the chalice, knowing that the wine had been tampered with, her nerve had failed her completely. The physical symptoms of her anxiety had manifested as the convenient indisposition that changed the protocol, and she had been genuinely relieved when Reverend Clement had suggested drinking first himself. Inspector Slack listened to this confession with grim satisfaction, making careful notes and having Lady Caroline sign a formal statement. He explained that her cooperation would be noted, but that she would still face serious charges for her role in the conspiracy. Armed with her testimony, he obtained a warrant for Martin Gresham's arrest. The businessman was located within 48 hours, attempting to board a ship for Argentina under a false identity. He was returned to England to face charges of attempted murder. The trial that followed attracted considerable attention throughout England. Martin Gresham maintained his innocence, claiming that Lady Caroline had fabricated her story to protect herself, and that he had no knowledge of any plot to poison Mr. Ashford. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Thomas Bentley testified about the hit-and-run incident and provided details about Gresham's vehicle that had never been made public. Lady Caroline's confession was supported by telephone records, witness statements about Gresham's presence near St. Mary Mead, and forensic evidence linking him to the purchase of cyanide through a false identity. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Lady Caroline received a lighter sentence of 5 years in recognition of her cooperation with the investigation and the jury's belief that she had been manipulated by her cousin. She served 3 years in prison before being released on parole, a broken woman who spent the remainder of her days in quiet seclusion, shunned by the society she had once graced. Her younger sister's engagement had indeed been broken off, and the family name bore the stain of her crime for years to come. Mr. Ashford, deeply shaken by his narrow escape and the knowledge that he had been the intended victim, retired from legal practice and devoted himself to charitable work supporting victims of violent crime. He established a foundation in Sarah Collins' name to provide assistance to families affected by hit-and-run accidents and worked tirelessly to advocate for stronger penalties for drivers who fled the scene of accidents. He remained grateful to Miss Marple for her insight and to Reverend Clement for his counsel, visiting St. Mary Mead annually on the anniversary of the baptism to pay his respects. Reverend Clement made a full recovery from the poisoning, though the experience left him more conscious of his mortality and more determined to make the most of the time God granted him. He and Griselda welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Jane in honour of Miss Marple, 6 months after the trial concluded. Reverend Clement baptized her himself using the ordinary communion cups rather than the ceremonial chalice, which had been retired from use and placed in the church museum as a reminder of how close evil had come to triumph in their peaceful village. Miss Marple, reflecting on the case in the comfort of her cottage, remarked to her nephew Raymond during one of his visits that the affair had illustrated several important principles about human nature. People were capable of terrible actions when motivated by fear and desperation, she observed, and family loyalty could blind even intelligent individuals to the truth about those they loved. She noted that Lady Caroline's devotion to her cousin had been admirable in its intensity, but tragic in its consequences, leading her to participate in a plot that had nearly claimed an innocent life.